among the old buildings in downtown Los Angeles. The Hotel Cecil, once built as a luxurious hotel, gradually became known by the city's darkest memories by the late 20th century. From its opening in 1924, the walls of the Cecil absorbed not only travelers, but also tragedies, loneliness, and unexplained losses. Over time, the adjective dark that came to be associated with its name was not merely a legend. It was the product of a past filled with real events and documented cases. This story is not just based on rumors. It is the sum of incidents confirmed through police reports, newspaper clippings, employee testimonies, and eyewitness accounts. Even in its early records, the Hotel Cecil had already begun to see deaths by the 1930s. Official documents note that in 1931, a guest named W.K. Norton was found dead in his room from poison capsules. Subsequently, in 1932, 1934, 1937, and the following years, incidents within the building resulting in suicide, falls, or death occurred repeatedly. Most of these cases were recorded as simple incidents. However, the occurrence of similar events in the same building, one after another, indicated that the Cecil's fate was quietly beginning to darken. Her link articles, some cases made it into the newspapers. Pauline Ayton, 1962, tragically lost her life after jumping from a high floor, also affecting a passerby. A woman, Ame Pigeon Gold Yaskud, 1964, was assaulted and died. The details of this incident were documented in public records. Therup. During these years, many of the hotel's residents were not ordinary visitors, but people with troubled pasts, those struggling with loneliness, or those living on the streets. The hotel existed on that thin line between life and death. By the mid-1980s, the hotel had become notorious, not only for tragic deaths, but also for its association with criminal figures. Richard Ramirez, nicknamed Tonight Stoker, stayed at the Cecil while terrorizing Los Angeles with a series of violent assaults. Witnesses reported that he disposed of his blood-stained clothes in a dumpster behind the hotel, and no one paid much attention. Around 1991, Austrian serial killer Jack Unterweger also stayed at the Cecil. Despite his past murders, he remained on American soil for a time. These two figures reinforced the perception of the hotel's connection to crime. During those years, former hotel managers stated that while working at the Cecil, they frequently received emergency calls. One of them even described it as a place where you could expect 1, 2, 3 calls per day. Perhaps the most internationally recognized tragedy in the Cecil's history is the case of Elisa Lam in 2013. Elisa Lam was a 21-year-old university student from Canada. She had set out to travel through California and checked into the Cecil on January 26, 2013. Shortly after, she began having issues with other guests in her room. Her behavior was sometimes described as abnormal. Because of this, management moved her to a different room a few days later. People.com. Elisa was last seen on January 31st. An employee and the manager of a nearby bookstore reported that she was acting strangely in the hotel lobby and surrounding areas that day. Her parents, expecting to speak with her on the phone, were unable to reach her. People.com. Soon after, footage from the hotel's security cameras was released. The video showed Eliza moving oddly in an elevator, peering around the corners as if avoiding something, and eventually exiting the elevator. This footage was viewed and discussed by millions within a short period. After weeks of searching, on February 19, 2013, complaints from other guests about water pressure and taste prompted maintenance to check the rooftop water tanks. There, in a tragic turn, Elisa's body was discovered. She had been inside the water tank for a long time. The Los Angeles County Coroner's Office found no signs of trauma or assault during the autopsy, despite the absence of physical injury or evidence of foul play. It was determined that Elisa had not been adequately managing her bipolar disorder, and her death was officially ruled an accidental drowning. Elisa's family, speaking to police and in documentaries such as Crime Scene, The Vanishing at the Cecil Hotel, explained that her behavior in the days leading up to her death could have been a result of her bipolar disorder. Wikipedia, the combination of the disappearance, the elevator footage, and the discovery of her body in a water tank cemented the Cecil Hotel's name in the public consciousness as a place of darkness. Claims have appeared in the media that a former manager, after working at the hotel for many years, reported witnessing approximately 80 deaths. Some employees commented, "You can't even count how many deaths happened in a place like this, because there were cases every single day." Reddit. Police officers also noted that the number of emergency calls from the Cecil was high, with assaults, suicides, and violent incidents being part of the routine calls they had to handle. Theory. The story of the Hotel Cecil is not limited to a single incident. From its inception, it has been associated with death, tragedy, dark events, and unexplained occurrences. Over time, these cases have been documented, both in the press and in documentaries. Today, the Cecil is no longer a bustling vacation spot under its former name. It is remembered by many researchers, historians, and media outlets as one of the darkest symbols in Los Angeles history. This text is based on facts drawn from police reports, media records, and the accounts of employees and witnesses. Incidents like the Elisa Lam case have contributed to the hotel's terrifying reputation. But real fear does not stem from a single event. It arises from the accumulation of tragedies over the years and the marks they leave on people. In those years, trains arriving in Los Angeles carried not only passengers, but also hope. The faces of people stepping out of the carriages bore the same expression, a mixture of fatigue and expectation. No one spoke their dreams out loud, yet the thought was shared by all. Here, everything could start anew. The city had not yet fully awakened. Streetlights left some corners in darkness at night. This darkness was not frightening, it was simply unknown. People were not yet afraid of the unknown, because the unknown still meant hope. The Hotel Cecil rose in the middle of this atmosphere. During its construction, locals remarked that the building seemed overly serious. Very thick walls, very high ceilings, very few decorations. Some said it felt as if the building was designed to silence people, but no one took such words seriously. When the doors opened in 1924, the first guests noticed something. The air inside was not the same as the city outside. Time seemed slower within. Footsteps echoed a moment later. Conversations seemed to bounce off the walls and return. This was oddly comforting, yet it left a strange feeling as if the building was listening. People waiting in the lobby preferred not to look at one another. No one asked where anyone had come from, because everyone had left something behind. Some wanted to forget, some simply not to remember. Years later, hotel staff would recount that even in Cecil's early days, some rooms felt colder than others. Despite the heating working, this was noted as a technical issue. Yet those same rooms would continue to be remembered in the same way in the years to come. At first, no one saw this as a sign. People only notice signs when they look back. The Cecil was different at night. Corridors felt longer. Passing by a door, it seemed as if someone were inside, but the door never opened. These feelings were not spoken of, because everyone was tired, and fatigue plays tricks on the mind. But those tricks had begun to accumulate. When examining the plans of the Hotel Cecil, the first thing that stands out is the lack of ornamentation. At a time when many hotels were filled with elaborate details, the Cecil was built with deliberate simplicity. The walls were thick, the doors heavy, and the corridors unnecessarily long. This was less an aesthetic choice and more a way to create a feeling. Architects' notes stated that the building was meant to calm people. But calm does not always mean peace. Sometimes calm allows a person to hear their own thoughts more clearly, and not everyone is ready to confront their thoughts. The hotel's most striking feature was the behavior of sound. Conversations did not echo. Even footsteps seemed muted. When a door closed, it made a deeper than usual sound, which quickly ended, as if the building was absorbing it. Some guests reported that at night they would lose all sense of time. Light coming through the windows was insufficient, and corridor lamps were dim. People would struggle to tell day from night, which particularly is unsettled those staying alone. The rooms at Cecil were similar, but staff gradually noticed that some felt different. These rooms were quieter, colder, and guests often wanted to leave them early. When asked why, the answer was usually the same: "I couldn't sleep here." Inability to sleep was one of the earliest signs of Cecil's effect. At night, the building shifted into a different rhythm. Elevators moved slower. Walking through the corridors, one could hear their own breathing more clearly. This comforted some but unnerved others, because silence amplifies the inner voice. Years later, an employee recalled, "Sometimes, during the night shift, I'd sit alone in the lobby and hear a door slam above me, but when I checked the logbook, no one was on that floor." These small occurrences were rarely reported, as they seemed explainable. Perhaps the building settled, perhaps the air shifted, but as they repeated, staff preferred not to speak of them, because speaking made things feel more real. The architecture of the Cecil made it easy for people to be alone. Long corridors separated guests. Communal areas were limited. People withdrew to their rooms and stayed there. This became especially noticeable among long-term residents. Some guests would not leave their rooms for days. Meals were left at the door, taken quietly. Faces were rarely seen. This was not a problem for the hotel, because the Cecil disturbed no one. But being undisturbed is not always a good thing. A building that allows people to be so easily alone also gives space for dark thoughts. And Cecil did exactly that. The walls protected but also separated. It muffled sounds but amplified thoughts. So some of those who stayed there began to feel the building was not watching them, but it was not leaving them alone either. It was merely observing. By 1929, the atmosphere in the city had visibly changed. The streets were still crowded, but people's gazes were different. Conversations had grown shorter. Sentences of hope were fewer. Everyone sensed that something was wrong, but no one knew how deep it would go. The Great Depression did not silence Los Angeles all at once. First, it slowed it down. Then, it stopped Italiano. Job's Bunny said plans were postponed, and some people changed overnight into someone else. This shift was felt most clearly in temporary places: hotels, boarding houses, rented rooms. The Hotel Cecil was at the very center of this change. Guests who once stayed for just a few days were replaced by people staying weeks or months. They arrived with fewer belongings. Suitcases were small, but the weight on their faces was heavier. No one declared how long they would stay, but few ever left. The same names began appearing repeatedly in the reception logs. The same room requests. The same floors. Some people insisted on the same room because change frightened them. Change was dangerous. During this period, the silence inside the Cecil took on a different form. It was no longer peaceful, it was expectant. It was as if the building itself was waiting for something to happen. Some guests described sitting for long periods at their windows at night, staring at the streets below, at people, at the light. But these looks were detached, more like observation than engagement, as if they were no longer part of the city. Hotel staff noticed the change in guests' behavior but did not see it as something to report. Everyone was changing in those years. The Cecil was merely a mirror of that change. One of the first notable recorded cases from this period involved a man who had stayed in the same room for a long time. He had not left for days. Meals began piling up at the door. The door remained closed, but no one immediately noticed, because at the Cecil, no one disturbed anyone. When the door finally opened, the silence from inside spilled out. The police were called. A record was made. A short note appeared in the papers. Life went on, but for the Cecil, this was a threshold. After this event, similar situations began to increase. People came and gradually became invisible, and sometimes this invisibility became irreversible. The Great Depression had taken not only people's money, but also their connections. Those staying inside the Cecil had less contact with the outside world. Phones rang less. Visits were almost non-existent. For some guests, the Cecil had become their last link to the world, and that link was slowly weakening. At night, the building felt heavier. Walking down the corridors, one felt slower. People sat quietly behind doors. No one knew anyone, yet everyone sensed that something was wrong. This wrongness was not yet clear fear. It was a creeping unease.
The Cecil did not hide this unease, but it did not show it to anyone either.
And day by day, it grew accustomed to living with it. At the Hotel Cecil, some stories never make the headlines. No lengthy reports are kept, and years later, they are rarely remembered. Yet these are the tales that leave the deepest mark on the building's spirit, because they are lived quietly and end quietly. There is a small record from the early 1930s about an elderly woman staying at the hotel. The log contains just a few lines. She did not leave her room for a long time. The door remained closed. Authorities were informed. These lines do not convey the weight of what truly happened, which went far beyond a few words. The woman had come alone, carrying almost nothing, just a small bag, a few clothes, and letters she had evidently kept for years. Once settled in her room, she spoke to no one. She took her meals from the door and was unseen for days. No one found this unusual, because disappearing at the Cecil was hardly unexpected. People came here to vanish. She was only noticed because trays began to pile up at her door. When the room was finally entered, the air inside felt different, heavier, more motionless. The window was shut. The clock had stopped. The room seemed suspended outside of time. The incident was quickly closed. It did not appear in newspapers, and in police records it remained a small file. But staff began to talk about it quietly, because this was not the first and it would not be the last. Similar stories slowly accumulated. A man who stayed for long periods never left his room. His light remained on at night. Passers-by in the corridor could see the glow beneath the door. One night the light went out, yet no one noticed until the next day. A young guest in another room spent days sitting in front of a mirror. A neighbor reported hearing the creak of a chair throughout the night, but when the door was opened, the room was empty, with only the chair by the window remaining. These kinds of accounts never make it into official records, yet they begin to circulate inside the Cecil. Staff pass them on in whispers. Guests feel them, though they cannot put them into words. This was the hotel's most frightening aspect. What happened there could not be fully explained. There was no shouting danger, only a slowly increasing weight. Some employees avoided certain floors at night. They never said it outright, but they altered their paths because the air on those floors felt different. Not colder, but emptier. One staff member would recall years later. Sometimes, passing by a door, I would feel as if someone were inside, but when I opened it, the room was empty. Still, the feeling never went away. These stories accumulated, shaping the Cecil's identity. The hotel was no longer just a building. It had become a repository of lives lived, yet left incomplete. And this sense of incompleteness was felt most clearly at night, in the corridors, as if something had been left unfinished, and the building remembered. Over time, a change became noticeable at the Hotel Cecil, but it was never spoken aloud. This change did not come with a single event. It came with habit. When people grow accustomed to certain things, they stop questioning them. The Cecil had become exactly such a place. Long-term guests no longer surprised anyone. Those who did not leave their rooms for days went unnoticed. Plates piling up at doors eventually seemed normal. The Cecil had grown used to invisibility, and this invisibility had become part of how the hotel functioned. This habit was felt not only by the staff, but by the building itself. It was as if the hotel was breathing heavier, falling silent later at night, waking later in the morning. Visitors noticed it, but could not explain why. Over time, some floors became less preferred than others. This preference was rarely spoken aloud, but when keys were handed out at the front desk, there was a subtle hesitation. Guests sometimes declined a floor. When asked why, no clear answer came. "I just didn't feel like it," they would say. Those staying on these floors began reporting similar experiences: inability to sleep, remaining awake throughout the night, and inexplicable unease by morning. Yet these feelings were never recorded as complaints, because there was no tangible problem, only a sense, and feelings do not appear in official records. The fear of the Cecil began precisely here, invisibly, untouchably, yet deeply felt. Some nights, the elevator would stop while empty, and the doors would open. No one was inside, yet the doors remained open for a few seconds, as if waiting for someone to exit before closing again. This was never reported, as it could be explained as a technical issue. But as it repeated, people learned not to watch, because to watch was to acknowledge it. During this period, small rumors began circulating in the city. No one said anything directly frightening. Most comments were mild. "It's a heavy place. You feel strange when you stay there. Short stays are better." These phrases were harmless on their own, but together they painted a picture. The Cecil had become a place where people did not want to stay long, yet those who arrived did not leave quickly. It was as if the building took people in, but was in no hurry to let them out. At night, passersby sometimes looked at its windows. Some remained dark all the time. Others would suddenly light up at some hour, staying illuminated for a long while, as if someone were awake, as if someone were thinking. But what? That question was never answered. As part one comes to a close, it should be noted, the Hotel Cecil never did anything to become a bad place. It simply made no sound about what happened within, and sometimes silence can carry consequences heavier than anything else. As time passed, the movement inside the Hotel Cecil changed. But this change was not sudden. No one woke up one morning and said, "This place is different now." The change happened slowly, so slowly that even those inside had difficulty noticing. The Cecil did not teach people to do anything new. It simply left them as they were. By the late 1930s, the hotel's reception logs began to look different. The same names appeared repeatedly. The same rooms were never left empty for months. Some guests did not specify a checkout date. They simply wrote, "A little longer." How long that period lasted was never clear. These guests usually arrived with few belongings, no large suitcases, no excess. It was as if they already knew they would stay a long time, but did not even want to admit it to themselves. When settling in, belongings were not fully placed in the closets. Everything seemed temporary, but as the temporary extended, it grew hairy. Some long-term guests would not leave their rooms for days. Windows stayed closed, curtains drawn. Without sunlight, the sense of time disappeared. Morning and evening merged. For some, this felt coming a relief from the outside world, but this relief did not last. Staff grew accustomed to not noticing these guests. Names were known, but faces were not clearly remembered because they were rarely seen. Passing in the corridors, eye contact was avoided. A brief nod was enough. No one wanted to speak, because speaking meant acknowledging their presence. And here, the fear of the Cecil began to form. People were alone, but this was not ordinary solitude. It was a solitude that forced one to confront oneself, and no one can endure being alone with themselves for long. Some nights, the corridors were quieter than usual, as if no one were in the building. Yet behind the doors, people were breathing. People were awake. People were thinking. Silence magnified these thoughts. Long-term guests shared similar behaviors. They were awake at night, asleep during the day. Some stared at the same spot for hours on the same chair, by the same window, against the same wall. At first, this went unnoticed, but as it repeated, it began to draw attention. One employee recalled years later, "Some of the people staying here seemed to slowly become transparent. You could feel their presence as you passed, but their faces didn't stick in your memory." This feeling was unsettling, yet inexplicable, and inexplicable things, over time, are accepted. The Cecil did not consume its long-term guests. It did not press them. It did not act upon them. It simply observed, and this act of observation spread through every floor of the building. There were certain rooms where people stayed longer. The room numbers became known among staff over time, but this knowledge was never shared, because to share it was to take responsibility, and no one wanted responsibility. Night. Those passing these rooms sensed movement inside, but no sound came. No light appeared, yet the feeling that something was there never vanished. It pressed down on the shoulders like a weight. Long-term guests sometimes left suddenly, without warning. Keys were left at the desk. After cleaning, little remained in the room. A few papers. Sometimes a note, sometimes nothing at all, as if they had never lived there. But the Cecil never forgot. Time had flowed differently in these rooms. The air was heavier. Even after cleaning, that weight remained. Staff tried to spend less time in these rooms themselves, never fully knowing why. For the Cecil, long-term guests were no longer exceptions. They had become part of the order. The hotel had grown used to them, and to grow used to something is, without realizing it, to accept it. In this chapter, the identity of the Cecil becomes clearer. This place was no longer merely a site for lodging. It had become a place where people were left alone with themselves, and sometimes they could not return from it. At the Hotel Cecil, doors did not always mean the same thing. Some doors simply separated one room from another. Others cut everything inside completely off from the outside world. Over time, staff noticed when a door closed at the Cecil. It wasn't just the space that should eat, was the people inside as well. Most long-term guests wanted to isolate their rooms from the world. Doors were locked, curtains drawn, lights dimmed. There are no clear records of what happened inside these rooms, because those within were often unnoticed. The Cecil was a hotel of the unnoticed. Some rooms went days without being opened. Meals left at the door were taken inside quietly, but the door remained closed. Plates were silently drawn in. The door closed again. These small movements indicated that someone was still inside, but no one knew who. Staff never knocked twice. A second knock could disturb the silence within. Silence at the Cecil was not a rule, but a balance. And when balance was broken, no one knew what might happen. On some nights, faint sounds were reported from behind these doors, not conversations, more like the subtle shifting of someone inside the room. This unsettled the staff, but did not scare them. Fear here did not come as an overt threat. It was felt more as an unease gnawing quietly at the mind. One employee recalled years later, "When I stood in front of certain rooms, it felt as if someone inside were listening. But when I opened the door, that feeling did not disappear." These kinds of accounts never made it into official records, yet they circulated within the Cecil. People did not speak of them, but they felt. Demand. What is felt slowly begins to change behavior. Some guests reported standing outside their doors for long stretches at night, without opening them, without stepping into the corridor, just standing there. By morning, they barely remembered these moments, but awoke exhausted, as if something had kept them awake all night. Behind closed doors, time flowed differently. Hours stretched, days blurred, thoughts became heavier, repeating and growing, taking on an inevitability. The Cecil did not intervene in this process. The hotel neither disturbed nor saved anyone. Here, everyone was responsible for their own silence. But sometimes, that silence became a burden. Even after rooms emptied, some doors remained closed. Cleaning would take place, but the room would not be immediately given to a new guest. A weight lingered there. It could not be measured, but it could be felt. Staff moved quickly through these rooms, keeping the lights on. When doors closed, the Cecil seemed to hold its breath. When doors opened, everything returned to normal, but that normal was slightly incomplete, slightly quieter, slightly heavier. In this chapter, another aspect of the Cecil becomes clear. This was a place where people closed themselves in, and once some doors closed, those inside could never leave as they once had. When the windows of the Hotel Cecil were first built, they existed simply to let in light and to watch the city. They were wide, tall, and looked out over Los Angeles of that era. During the day, sunlight streamed in. At night, the pale glow of street lamps flickered on the glass. Initially, the windows gave a sense of openness, but over time, that feeling changed. For guests on the upper floors, the windows began to take on a different meaning. Guests on these floors moved less within their rooms. Chairs were usually pulled in front of the windows. Curtains were left slightly ajar, never fully opened. They looked outside, but as if not really watching the world below. More often, it was a state of waiting a gaze that did not meet the city's eyes. When staff first noticed this, they paid it little mind. People liked to look at a view, but the stairs in the Cecil were different. They were long silent, and often lasted for hours. On some nights, passers-by in the upper floor corridors would notice the lights spilling from the windows. These lights did not go out, until morning. Someone inside was awake, but what they were doing was unknown. No book was read, no writing done. They simply remained still. One employee recalled years later, when passing rooms on the upper floors with lights on, I felt as if someone inside were watching me. But when I looked at the door, it was closed. The feeling was vague. It did not present as a threat, but it was like a shadow on the back of your neck. Its presence felt, but its shape unseen. At night, the windows were quieter. The city beyond appeared distant. The sounds of traffic barely reached the upper floors. This height separated people from the city. Life went on below, but upstairs, time felt heavier. Some guests reported feeling dizzy when standing before the window. It seemed physical, but the sensation did not pass when the windows were closed. The unease came from within, not from outside. Staff cleaning the upper floor rooms would instinctively avoid approaching the windows. The glass was solid, safe, yet an instinctive distance was maintained, because the window was more than glass. It was a threshold. Thresholds in the Cecil were always dangerous. Even after rooms emptied, curtains often remained drawn. They were not opened until a new guest arrived, as if the room did not wish to look outside. No one ever documented this, but it became routine. At night, lights from the city reflected on the glass, making the room seem even darker. One could see their own reflection, but it never looked entirely familiar. Darkness altered faces. Guests on these floors sometimes stood before the window near dawn. They were awake. They did not speak. When asked questions, they gave brief answers, as if leaving their thoughts somewhere else. The Cecil did not close the windows. It did not post warning signs. It did not say that something could be dangerous, because danger at the Cecil was not spoken aloud. It was felt, and the windows became one of the clearest places where this feeling was experienced. In this chapter, the fear of the Cecil rose further. Height added weight, gazes added gravity, and people began to feel. Sometimes the quietest places are the ones that make you think the most.
Not everything that happened at the Hotel Cecil made it into the newspapers.
In fact, very little of it ever leaked out. Most events seemed insignificant when viewed on their own. A guest leaving suddenly, a room remaining empty longer than expected, an employee requesting a shift change. None of these, alone, would have made the news. But at the Cecil, it was never about a single incident. The issue was the accumulation of these small events. As the 1930s gave way to the 1940s, internal logs at the hotel began to show. Room numbers were sometimes written incorrectly. Check-in and check-out times were unclear. The departure times of some guests were uncertain. There was a sense of a gap, a void, that did not disturb anyone directly, but could be felt. Whispers began circulating among the staff. These whispers carried more curiosity than fear, because people are first curious about what they don't understand. Fear comes later. Some nights, the reception phones would ring, but no one was on the line. The number appeared invisible. Initially, this was treated as a technical issue, but as it repeated, it became habitual. When the phone rang, it was answered, but no response was expected. Soon, it was expected that the phone would quiet itself. Staff sometimes reported hearing their names whispered in the corridors. The sound was never clear. It did not come as a direct call. It was more like a voice the ear wanted to perceive, vanishing as soon as one approached. These incidents were never formally reported, because they were not concrete enough. At the Cecil, the intangible was ignored. Small notes were kept about certain rooms. Guests appeared unsettled. Light stayed on all night. Room vacated early. Over the years, these notes accumulated, but no one read them all together. Had they been read collectively, perhaps a pattern would have emerged. To outsiders, the hotel maintained a calm appearance. The Cecil remained a centrally located, affordable hotel, but among the staff, a sense of unease grew. This unease was not sudden. It settled in slowly, almost imperceptibly. Some employees began to avoid working on certain floors. When asked why, they gave vague answers. "That floor doesn't feel right to me." No one spoke directly, because what was said might be true. The most disturbing aspect of events that never reached the press was uncertainty. No one knew exactly what was happening, but the sense that something was wrong grew stronger. The Cecil learned to live with this uncertainty. So did the staff, and over time it became normalized, and what becomes normal is often the most dangerous. In this chapter, the dark history of the Cecil begins to take shape. It had no name yet, no reputation, but within, things were accumulating. Silences, voids, small unanswered questions, all waiting for the right time to come together. For a long time, the Hotel Cecil was a place known only to those who lived within it. From the outside, it appeared ordinary, centrally located, cheap, crowded a stop for those trying to survive in the city. But over time, the way people spoke its name began to change. This shift did not happen overnight. It began with small conversations in cafes, at bus stops, in backstreet bars. When someone mentioned the Cecil, their voice would drop slightly. They would hesitate Often, the sentence was left unfinished. Everyone felt the same thing, yet no one wanted to speak it aloud. Something was happening. This something was not clear. There were no major headlines in the newspapers. No official statements had been made, yet the people of the city, especially those who spent time near the Cecil, began to notice certain things. Those leaving the hotel looked different, tired, distant, as if they had temporarily stayed somewhere else entirely. Some who stayed for only a few days never returned to their friends the same way. Even if they came back, they were changed. Their eyes would fixate they would fall silent mid-sentence. They answered questions. The change was inexplicable, but undeniable. Phrases began to circulate through the city. "Don't stay there. The Cecil is a strange place. It doesn't do people any good." These were not warnings, nor threats. They were more like passing on experience traces, left by things lived but unspoken. Hotel staff also sensed the change. Outsiders, gazers had shifted. Guests asked more questions at check-in. Some insisted on specific room numbers. Some refused upper floors. Some avoided rooms near windows. Some changed their minds mid-check-in and left without explanation, as if they had sensed something upon entering. The Cecil's name was no longer spoken aloud, but whispers grew stronger. For whispers are the clearest form of fear. They don't scream. They don't run. They simply settle. During this period, events at the hotel became impossible to ignore. Small incidents began to pile up. A guest leaving abruptly in the middle of the night. A room left empty for weeks. An employee quitting suddenly. None of these alone were significant, but together, they became unsettling. Management paid little attention to these rumors. Rumors cannot be controlled, and what cannot be controlled is ignored. The hotel remained full. Guests continued to arrive, yet the profile of those arriving began to shift. Now, more came seeking escape. Those who wanted to hide. Those who wanted to lose themselves. Not from the city, but from life itself. And the Cecil did not close its doors to them. At this point, the hotel stopped being just a place and became a state. The Cecil was no longer simply an address. People began speaking of it as somewhere you fell into, rather than stayed. This phrasing was no coincidence, for the Cecil did not hold those who entered, but it did not return them as they were. Guests did not leave carrying the same burdens they brought inside. They came out either heavier or diminished. The city felt this, and as it felt, the Cecil's name was spoken less but thought of more. In this chapter, the darkness of the Cecil began to extend beyond its walls. The hotel's walls began to speak to the city not with words, but with consequences, and the city lit. After the Hotel Cecil's name began to be spoken in whispers, the city's silence shifted. People no longer just said it was strange. Now, they were starting to remember. Dates became clearer. Events were no longer discussed individually. They were spoken of as a chain. The first major tragedies were, in fact, the ones no one dared to call major. They did not arrive shouting. They did not immediately fill newspaper headlines. Each occurred quietly, and each ended quietly. But nothing that happened inside the Cecil ever truly ended. A guest stayed in their room for an unusually long time. This was not uncommon at the Cecil. Days passed. The door remained closed. When it finally opened, the silence inside unsettled everyone. The room was tidy, the bed made, the window closed, yet something was missing. It was not the furniture. It was the void left by a human being. This incident was recorded simply. The guest had left. How and when remained unclear. No one asked further questions, because questions could demand answers. Then another incident occurred. This time a guest left late at night. The clerk at the reception would later say, they never forgot the expression on that face. There was no panic, no rush, only a profound weariness, as if returning from a long journey. That guest was never seen again. As such events increased, conversations among the staff began to change. It was no longer only about feelings. Dates were spoken, room numbers whispered, who stayed where, how long, and how they left. These details were unofficial but etched into memory. Gradually, the city began to hear about these incidents, but the accounts were never complete. Every retelling left something out. No one knew the full story. This made the stories even more unsettling, as the gaps were filled by imagination. Small newspaper mentions began to appear back pages, short columns, vague and lacking detail. Headlines read, "Incident at a downtown hotel," sometimes naming the Cecil, sometimes not. But the city knew which hotel it was. The Cecil's reputation was built this way, not with a single explosion, but by the accumulation of small drops. During this period, the profile of guests changed further. Some came intentionally, drawn by curiosity. Some sought to approach fear. Others arrived unwittingly but sensed, upon entering, that something was different. Some guests left after only a few hours, never going up to their rooms. They would linger at the reception, looking around, then leave silently. Entering alone had been enough. The Cecil did nothing to halt this attention. It neither denied rumors nor offered explanations. Silence was its strongest defense. Through silence, anything remained possible. The first major tragedies seemed to have passed, but in reality, they were only the beginning. The Cecil was now being tested, and the city was watching the results. From this point onward, the Cecil could no longer remain an ordinary hotel. Its name had become part of a story, and with every telling, that story grew darker. The darkness of the Cecil was no longer hidden. It simply had not yet fully revealed itself, but its revelation was imminent. At a certain point, the way people spoke about the hotel Cecil began to change. Sentences were no longer left unfinished. People no longer fell silent while exchanging glances. When Tinami Cecil was spoken, there would be a brief pause in the room, and then someone would inevitably recall something from the past, a familiar face, a story, a rumor, a warning. At Tista, fear ceased to be purely individually and became part of a collective memory. This is how a city's memory forms. No one knows exactly what happened, but everyone feels they know something. This asile had become the center of that feeling. People began to walk faster on the streets nearby. At night, passers-by would avert their eyes from the building. Even during the day, some avoided lingering in front of it. This fear was not voiced aloud, yet it manifested in behavior. Cecil was no longer thought of as a place to stay, became a place to avoid. Taxi drivers preferred not to drop off passengers in front of its doors. Some drivers would lock their windows while passing. When asked why, there was never a clear answer. "I just didn't feel like it," they would say. Instincts outpaced conscious thought. Stories circulating in the city grew darker. They were no longer merely about oddities. They were about consequences. How people who stayed at Cecil changed afterward. How one guest withdrew into themselves. How another vanished from the city entirely. How someone else took a long time to recover. No one could say which stories were entirely true, but they all converged at a single point. Cecil did not leave people as they were. The hotel management was aware, but it was too late to intervene. Once fear had settled, explanations could not erase it. They would only amplify it. So Cecil chose to remain silent. It did not close its doors. It did not dim its lights. It carried on as if everything were normal, and that normalcy was the most unsettling thing of all. For the staff, things became even more difficult. Some quit. Some took extended leave. The remainder chose to adapt. In Cecil, adaptation was the only way to survive. But adapting changed a person. Some staff refused to work alone during night shifts, particularly on the upper floors. When asked why, the answers were always similar. Time flows differently there. These statements contained not fear, but exhaustion. Fear at Cecil did not shout to wear you down. Stories about Cecil began to be passed on to newcomers, a warning, a legacy. When people told one another, "Don't stay there," they did not raise their voices. It was as if they did not want to anger Cecil. Irrational, yes, but fear rarely obeys reason. The building remained the same. The walls were the same. The rooms were the same. But its meaning had changed. Cecil was no longer a structure. It had become a symbol, a quiet reflection of the city's dark side. But at this point, Cecil's story had not neared its end. It had deepened. Once fear enters the collective memory, it feeds itself. New events summoned the old stories, paved the way for the new, and Cecil stood at the very center of this cycle. Silent, dark, and remembered. At a certain point, when people started talking about Hotel Cecil, they no longer chose their words carefully. Sentences that were once left unfinished were now completed. Whispers gave way to low but clear conversations. Cecil was no longer described merely as strange or ominous. A more definitive word began to be used. Dangerous. This word was never spoken aloud, but its meaning was shared by everyone. The city began to put distance between itself and Cecil. This distance was not physical, for the building remained in the same place. The streets still ran past it, but people changed direction. Night walks were taken along other streets. Those who had to pass in front of Cecil quickened their steps. This avoidance gradually became a habit. New residents were told about Cecil, like a neighborhood rule. There was no explicit prohibition, but a strong suggestion existed. Don't stay there. Don't get involved, because it was believed that Cecil had a way of drawing people in. This idea made little logical sense, but it was widespread. Some people, however, grew especially curious about Cecil. Things said to be dangerous always attract attention. These people were different from the others when entering the building. They looked more carefully. They were quieter, as if they knew they were about to be tested. But Cecil made no distinction between the curious and the cautious. By this time, events in the hotel were being discussed more clearly. Some were recounted openly for the first time. A staff member quitting and leaving in the middle of the night. A guest changing rooms but still unable to settle. Another staying awake until dawn. These incidents were no longer seen as coincidences. They were considered a pattern, and patterns frighten people because they imply an order beyond control. The atmosphere inside Cecil grew heavier. Corridors felt longer. Elevator rides grew quieter. People preferred not to enter the elevator at the same time. This choice was not deliberate, but it was widespread. Among the staff, open warnings began to circulate about certain rooms, about certain floors. These warnings were not official, but they were taken seriously because everyone was feeling the same thing, a feeling that could not be put into words. It was collectively shared. The exterior of the hotel was also perceived differently. Even in daylight, the building appeared heavy. At night, even with the lights on, it felt dark, as if the lights did not illuminate the interior, but only hid what was there. Cecil had become a boundary for the city, an invisible line. Beyond that line, it felt as if turning back was difficult. This notion was exaggerated, but fear feeds on exaggeration. With this chapter, an important threshold in Cecil's story was crossed. People no longer considered only what had happened in the past, but also what could happen in the future. These thoughts fueled rumors. The rumors amplified the fear, and the fear was no longer temporary. Cecil had left a permanent mark on the city. Faces changed when its name was mentioned. Voices lowered, and everyone knew this. Some places exist that, even if you just pass by, pull you inside. At a certain point, the name of Hotel Cecil began to exist not only through what happened there, but also through what was told. Real events changed as they were passed from one person to another. Some details were lost. Others grew, but the emotion carried by the stories remained the same. Unease. BT's point, Cecil was no longer merely the sum of past events. Every new story added another layer to the building. People began to recount things they hadn't personally experienced, yet these tales didn't feel made up. Cecil's atmosphere made them possible. In the city, some had not experienced what happened at Cecil firsthand, but they would recount what happened to a relative, a friend, an acquaintance, a friend of a friend. As this chain grew, the stories became darker, but no one could completely deny them, because denying Cecil had become increasingly difficult. During this period, most of the stories told were about nights, sleeplessness, strange dreams, a lingering unease, even while awake. People said they could not sleep anywhere else after staying at Cecil. The silence weighed heavily on them, because Cecil's silence was different. For those accustomed to it, normal silence was insufficient. Some tales concerned the rooms. It was said that those who stayed in a particular room felt similar things. It wasn't that the room was cold. It was that the air was heavy, that upon entering, one felt constricted. This feeling could not be described, yet it was repeated again and again. Legends often begin this way, with small, repeated details. Stories about Cecil gradually spread beyond the city limits. Outsiders began to hear them as well. Some chose to stay at the hotel because of these stories. Others canceled their reservations after hearing them. Cecil received both reactions in silence. The hotel itself never told a story, but its walls seemed to listen. As people spoke, the building accepted these tales. This idea may have been illogical, but legends live not by logic, but by feeling. At this point, reality and story began to blend, which events had truly happened, which were exaggerated, which were completely added on. No one was certain, but there was one thing everyone knew. Cecil's name was no longer just the name of a building. It had become a symbol. People lowered their voices when speaking of Cecil, because saying certain things aloud made them more real. Cecil was already real enough. No more was needed. With this chapter, Cecil's story became uncontrollable. Neither management, nor the city, nor the guests could direct the Tylees anymore. The stories took their own path, and with every new telling, the darkness of the hotel deepened a little more. Cecil now carried the weight not only of what had happened, but also of what was told, and this weight had seeped into every floor of the building. Some places exist that, even if you leave them, their stories follow you. Cecil had become one of those places. For many years, Hotel Cecil had survived on silence. Rumors were suppressed by silence. Minor tragedies were brushed aside by silence. But no silence lasts forever. At some point, it accumulates, and when it accumulates, it can no longer be hidden. By the 1940s, what happened at Cecil could no longer be explained by feelings alone. The events were clearer, more visible, and most importantly, they had begun to repeat. This repetition had become undeniable, even for the staff working inside the hotel. Some nights, the reception appeared completely empty. The clerk was there, but seemed to exist as part of the space itself. He did not want to speak, because speaking would disperse the weight of the silence. And when that weight was dispersed, no one knew what would remain. During this period, it began to be reported that people staying at Cecil were experiencing similar things at night. Interrupted sleep, waking at the same hours, unexplained unease, tossing and turning in bed for hours. Individually, these could be considered ordinary, but experienced in the same building, at the same times, in the same way, they became unsettling. Some guests would leave their rooms in the early morning and wander the corridors, barefoot, silent, without knowing where they were going. In the morning, they could not clearly remember these moments, but they reported sore feet, as if they had walked for hours. The staff witnessed this, but they did not intervene, because sometimes intervention at Cecil only made things worse. People calmed down when left to themselves, but when spoken to, asked about, or stopped, something would break. During this period, some rooms were officially closed. Renovation was given as the reason, but no renovations were done. The doors stayed shut, the lights remained off. Over time, these rooms became forgotten spaces within the hotel. Their existence was known, but they were not discussed. The corridors of Cecil began to feel longer during these years. Walking from one room to another felt like it took more time than usual. This was not a physical phenomenon. It was a mental perception. People thought while walking, and at Cecil. Some staff members later recounted that after leaving the hotel, they never even set foot on the street where it was located again. Even years later, when asked why, there was no clear answer. "It closes in on me," they would say. This phrase became a common way to describe Cecil. During this period, the world outside the hotel was also changing. The city was growing. Noise was increasing, but inside Cecil, none of this noise penetrated. Time flowed differently within. Silence still existed, but it was no longer enough, because silence could no longer hide what was happening. Some events began to be spoken of directly, not behind closed doors. Openly, who had stayed where? How long before someone had been replaced, who had never been seen again? These conversations were not secret, but they were not spoken aloud either. Near Cecil, voices were never raised. Hotel management made some changes to try to stop this trend, but these changes were superficial. New rules, new shifts, new arrangements. None of it lightened the weight inside the building, because the problem was not about rules. The problem was that Cecil was now holding on to things. With this chapter, another threshold was crossed in Cecil's story. Silence was no longer enough. Fear was no longer just felt, it was lived. And these experiences laid the groundwork for far darker events yet to be told. Cecil was now giving warnings, but these warnings did not come in words. They came in what was lived. For a long time, Hotel Cecil had managed to contain everything within itself. What happened stayed between the walls, and rumors changed shape once they left the hotel's doors. But by the mid-1940s, this balance broke. Silence cracked for the first time. And once that crack appeared, it could not be sealed. During this period, some events at Cecil had become too obvious to ignore. People no longer just called it strange. On summer nights, police cars would be parked in front of the building. No sirens sounded, yet their presence was felt. Even this alone was a powerful signal to the city. For the first time, outsiders began to witness directly what was happening inside Cecil. Staff lingering at a door for long stretches. Entire floors hurriedly evacuated. In the dead of night, small notices hanging at the reception in the morning with no explanation. These notices were vague. Temporary adjustment, they said, a technical matter. But no one fully believed these explanations. Even technical issues felt different at Cecil. In newspapers, Cecil's name was no longer hidden. It began to appear in small reports. The headlines were soft. Words were chosen carefully. But the name was written. This was a turning point for Cecil. Because once something is written down, it becomes permanent. Those who read these reports began to pause and look up when passing in front of the hotel, counting the windows, inspecting the floors. People were no longer just hearing about Cecil Day, were scrutinizing it. This act of scrutiny further thickened the atmosphere inside the hotel. Guests began to feel as though they were being watched. But this observation did not come from outside, it came from within. It was as if the building itself was observing those who noticed it more closely. For the staff, this period was one of the hardest. They had to carry not just what they felt, but what they saw. For some, The burden was too much. There were resignations, quietly, without explanation, but the expressions on those leaving told those who remained everything. Guests staying at Cecil had also changed. Most now stayed only briefly. Those who stayed longer had grown more withdrawn. People left their rooms less often, avoiding the common areas. It was as if everyone was trying to preserve their own silence. During this period, some nights brought a strange sense of activity within the hotel. Indistinct scurrying, doors opening and closing. The elevator being summoned repeatedly, but by morning, everything returned to normal. No trace remained. Cecil had learned not to leave traces. But this time, the city noticed silence was no longer what it used to be. It had cracked, and what seeped through that crack unsettled people. With this chapter, Cecil's story had entered an irreversible path. What happened was no longer just the hotel's problem, it was part of the city. Cecil had begun to lose the boundary between itself and the city. And this was the most dangerous stage, because when a place merges with the city, escaping it becomes more difficult. Cecil was no longer just a place to avoid. It had become a darkness that existed alongside the city itself. At a certain point, everyone at Hotel Cecil began to share the same feeling. This feeling resembled acceptance more than fear. As if what was happening could not be stopped. As if the building had charted its own path, and that path allowed no intervention. During this period, events no longer came one by one, they came in waves. Unease in one night would affect another floor. The next day, tension that started in a single room quickly spread through the corridor. Something was moving within Cecil, but it was not visible. It was felt. Staff became increasingly reluctant to come to their shifts. Night shifts were especially heavy. Hours crawled. Nights stretched endlessly. Those at the reception could hear the ticking of the clock more clearly than ever before. Normally unnoticed, but at Cecil, every small sound grew. On some nights, a strange order settled over the building. It was as if everyone went silent at once. Televisions were turned off. Conversations stopped. Doors closed more slowly. This silence was not conscious, but it was experienced collectively. Guests felt this weight as well. Many reported sleepless nights. They would try to sleep, only to wake just as they were drifting off. When asked why, there was no clear answer, only as if something was there. That something was never defined. Some guests switched rooms, but that did not help. The weight belonged not to the rooms, but to the building itself. Changing floors did not change the feeling. Sometimes it even intensified. Some people who stayed at Cecil reported that the feeling followed them even after they left. The need to look over their shoulder while walking down the street. Unease in quiet places. Feeling alone, even in a crowd. What began inside Cecil continued outside. As these stories spread through the city, Cecil's reputation darkened further. When the hotel's name was mentioned, people now spoke not only of the past, but also of its effects. Someone who stayed there can't recover for a while, they would say. These statements were vague, but unsettling. The hotel management took stricter measures during this time. Some floors were closed. Certain rooms were completely taken out of use. Yet these measures did not change the feeling inside the building. The problem was not physical. Cecil's problem was invisible. This invisible presence gradually became the building's identity. Cecil was no longer just a place, it was known as an experience. People no longer talked about going there, only about leaving. The question, how did you feel when you got out, became more important. With this chapter, Cecil's darkness was approaching its peak. The events did not stop. Silence was no longer protective. On the contrary, it made everything heavier. What had accumulated inside Cecil now wanted, in some way, to get out, and this release was a harbinger of even greater events. Cecil could no longer turn back. Because some places exist, and once you reach this point, they no longer just let you live, they make you experience. The years in which darkness slowly accumulated at Hotel Cecil were now behind them. This darkness was no longer hidden, suppressed, or contained. The building seemed to openly display everything it carried, and this state had become almost unbearable for both those inside and those looking from outside. During this period, the perception of time inside Cecil was almost completely distorted. Days blurred together. Nights seemed endless. Even during daylight hours, the interior of the hotel appeared dim. Sunlight streaming through the windows never fully reached inside. It was as if the building absorbed the light and refused to give it back. For the staff, these years were the hardest. They were no longer just performing a job. They were carrying the weight of the building itself. Some suppressed it out of habit. Others could not bear it. Those who left silently increased in number. Those who came in to replace them could not last long. Guests staying at Cecil also clearly felt this change. There was a sense of unease on their faces when entering the hotel. When leaving, that unease transformed into something different. Some did not want to speak. Others felt the need to recount everything. Yet what was recounted was never complete, because what had happened could not be contained by words. Be this period, some events at the hotel were openly discussed throughout the city. People gave dates, mentioned hours. The incidents had become clear, but there were still missing pieces. This absence made the stories even more unsettling. Some floors of Cecil had been almost entirely emptied. Doors were locked. Lights remained off. These floors had become dark zones within the hotel. Their existence was known, but no one entered. It was as if the building had sealed them off for itself. Those wandering the hotel at night would hesitate in front of these closed floors. A momentary pause, a step slowed, an instinct with no known cause. No one questioned this hesitation, because questioning at Cecil only added to the weight. During these years, the hotel's exterior also changed. The building seemed heavier than before. Even when its lights were on at night, the sense of darkness did not vanish. It was as if the building had accepted what was said about it. It no longer hid. The city, too, had to confront Cecil during this time. Avoidance was no longer enough. Ignoring it no longer worked. Cecil had established a permanent place in the city's collective memory. People told newcomers about it, warned them, shared the stories. This transmission was becoming a narrative passed down from generation to generation. With this chapter, Cecil's darkness reached its peak. This darkness was no longer a rumor. It was accepted as reality. People did not know why, but they understood the consequences. Cecil was a place that was not good for people, and this acceptance became what sealed the building's fate. Some places exist and write their own story, and that story becomes a part of everyone who enters. Cecil had become exactly such a place. The darkness of Hotel Cecil had been felt for a long time, but at some point, this darkness no longer remained just a feeling. The events themselves began to clearly show why the rumors and fears had arisen. People no longer said, "Something is happening," when talking about Cecil. They said, "These things happened During this period, some of the incidents at the hotel were officially recorded. They appeared in newspapers. They were included in police reports. Yet, the stories were never complete. There was always a gap between what was written and what had actually happened. Some guests at Cecil were found dead in their rooms, alone. These events mostly occurred during nighttime hours. Doors were locked. There was no sign of outside interference. Authorities recorded these cases as personnel tragedies. But the repeated use of the same term began to unsettle people, because these tragedies were not isolated. Over the years, the recurrence of similar events in the same building further darkened Cecil's reputation. People began to think that the hotel did not just attract people in difficult situations, it drove them even deeper into despair. This notion was not scientific, but it was widespread. During this time, there were also guests whose lives were completely changed after staying at Cecil. Some were unable to speak for a long time. Some left the city entirely. Others wanted to tell what they had experienced, but words failed them. Interviews were left unfinished. Sentences remained incomplete. The hotel's name became associated not only with tragedies, but also with certain dark figures known to have stayed there. Some of these individuals later became nationally known. The knowledge emerged years afterward. Yet when looking back, many people said, "I'm not surprised," because Cecil's atmosphere allowed such people to disappear without notice. Certain floors were particularly notable. Similar incidents had occurred repeatedly on the same floors. This was officially explained as coincidence. Yet among the staff, voices lowered whenever those floors were mentioned. New employees assigned to these floors rarely lasted long. The most unsettling aspect of Cecil was how everything returned to normal after incidents. Rooms were cleaned, carpets replaced, curtains renewed, yet the weight inside the building never dissipated. It was as if the events had been etched into the walls. As the city learned about these occurrences, public perception of Cecil grew harsher. The hotel was no longer just ominous. It was a place to be avoided. Yet its doors remained open. Cecil continued to operate. People continued to come, and this only intensified the fear. Because people began to ask, if so many things have happened, why is it still open? There was no clear answer to this question. With this chapter, Cecil's story entered a new stage. The darkness was no longer abstract. It had a history. It had dates. It had names. Yet nothing could ever be fully explained, and this was where Cecil's power lay. It was real, but incomplete. And everything left incomplete. Lives longer in the human mind. As the years passed, the city changed. Buildings were renovated. Streets grew crowded. Technology advanced, yet Hotel Cecil remained almost the same amid all this change. From the outside, it still looked like a hotel, but inside, time flowed differently. To pastries and tea, trapped between the walls. On the contrary, it seeped into the modern era. By the 1960s and beyond, Cecil was no longer remembered only for old stories. New events occurred, echoing the old ones in a haunting repetition. This sense of recurrence was the hotel's most unsettling feature. It was as if the building neither forgot the past nor allowed it to stay buried, even recreating it in the present. Some guests began reporting experiences strikingly similar to those recounted before. Waking at the same hours, feeling restless at the same times, losing one's way in the same corridor. When compared with past accounts, these experiences were nearly identical. They had stayed in the same building under different conditions, in different years, yet what they described overlapped. During this period, Cecil's name was no longer whispered in select circles, it was spoken openly. Newspapers began revisiting old incidents. Phrases like "this had happened in this building before" started appearing. Cecil was now being regarded as a chain of history. For the hotel staff, this era was far more oppressive. They carried not only the weight of the past, but also the stress of current events. New employees would hear the old stories and, within months, experience similar occurrences themselves. Even among staff, this cycle bred fear. Some workers refused to enter certain rooms. This refusal was unofficial, yet shift schedules began to reflect it. Everyone knew some rooms in Cecil were places where spending time simply did not feel safe. During this period, the relationship between the city and Cecil grew even stranger. People knew the hotel, but few wanted to talk about it. Simply saying its name felt uncomfortable, yet there were always those who were drawn to it. Cecil, with its darkness, attracted people, and this attraction was dangerous, because some of those who came to Cecil were already fragile, and the building did not hold the fragility. Deep decades later, experts would note this. At the time, however, it was just a feeling. With this chapter, Cecil's story entered a new phase. The past no longer remained in the past. It merged with current events, feeding on them. Cecil had entered a cycle, and this attraction was dangerous. And this cycle did not weaken. It strengthened. At a certain point, Hotel Cecil ceased to be just an old building tucked away in a dark corner of Los Angeles. The events that occurred there began to transcend the city's borders. News spread. Stories multiplied. Cecil's name came to be associated not only with the past but also with current events. During this period, some incidents at the hotel received broader coverage in the media. They were no longer just small corner articles. Details were recorded. Dates were specified. The repetition of events drew attention. With each new report, the weight of Cecil's name grew heavier. Particularly, the experiences of solo travelers began to be discussed. Short stays quiet. Arrivals, days spent without interacting with anyone. And then, sudden tragedies followed. Authorities investigated these incidents individually. Yet, when viewed as a whole, the picture was unsettling. Some people who had stayed at Cecil began recounting their experiences after leaving. Interviews were conducted. Documentary teams reviewed old records. The accounts were not precise, but the feelings were shared. There was something in that building that pressed on a person's chest. This phrase was repeated countless times. During this period, Cecil's past was revisited as well. Old newspaper clippings were unearthed. Records from years ago were examined again, and one thing became clear. The events were not random. They occurred in concentrated periods. They repeated on specific floors. This awareness further intensified the fear surrounding Cecil. People no longer said, "Bad things happened here." They began to say, "This building repeats things." This notion spread especially online. Forums, where it opened. Witness accounts were shared. The area around the hotel also changed with this reputation. Cecil's surroundings became a focal point for curious eyes. People taking photographs, onlookers staring at the building for long periods from outside. Those stopping at night to watch the windows. Cecil was becoming a symbol of fear. This attention made the atmosphere inside the hotel even heavier. The building now carried not only its own past, but also the expectations of people. Expectations of fear. Expectations of mystery. Expectations of darkness. Cecil did not disappoint these expectations. One of the most unsettling things during this period was that the hotel remained open. People questioned it after so many incidents. Why hadn't it been shut down? Why were guests still staying there? There it was. No clear answer. Yet Cecil's doors never closed, and perhaps this was what made the story even more terrifying, because Cecil continued to exist despite everything, silently, in its place, waiting, as if for the next arrivals. With this chapter, Cecil firmly took its place at the center of modern horror narratives. Real events merged with the stories told. The line between reality and narrative blurred, and this blurring made the fear all the more enduring. Cecil was no longer just a space for what had happened. It was a space for what was told. And every story told made it a little darker. At a certain point, the name of Hotel Cecil began to be mentioned alongside specific events. People no longer said, "Something is happening at Cecil." They spoke of specific dates, specific individuals, specific nights. This made the hotel's story all the more unsettling, because uncertainty had given way to a recognized darkness. During this period, some incidents brought Cecil into national attention. At first, these events appeared as ordinary news, but as details emerged, that sense of normalcy vanished. People began asking similar questions. Why always this building? Why the same atmosphere? Why the same kinds of loneliness? Some of these incidents began with guests suddenly disappearing from Cecil. People went days without a trace. Their rooms were empty. Their belongings remained, but they themselves were gone. These cases were explained in various ways days later, yet this process only deepened the darkness surrounding Cecil's name. In some instances, it emerged that certain situations went unnoticed for long periods inside the hotel. This revealed just how differently time flowed within Cecil. Days had passed, yet no one had noticed. This reality shook people deeply, because for so much to happen inside a building and remain undetected was frightening in itself. During this period, documentaries, interviews, and articles about Cecil increased. Journalists reached out to former employees. Former guests were interviewed. Their accounts overlapped. All spoke of an indescribable pressure within the building, as if something suppressed a person's inner voice. The events occurring at night were particularly striking. People waking at the same hours, unease felt in the same corridors, recurring complaints in the same rooms. These similarities suggested that the events were not random. During this period, Cecil's name also spread through internet culture. Long forum threads were opened. People shared their experiences. Some wrote that they had stayed only one night, but could not shake its effects for days. Others said Cecil had a pulling quality, drawing people inward. As these accounts multiplied, the fear of Cecil reached a wider audience. No longer was it known only to the residents of Los Angeles. People from around the world recognized the building. Cecil had become one of the darkest symbols of modern times. The hotel management tried to control this attention. Statements were released. Renovation projects were mentioned. Yet these explanations did not lessen the weight of what had happened. People now looked not at official statements, but at the events themselves. With this chapter, Cecil's story had become a darkness known to nearly everyone. Real events merged with the stories told. Fear was no longer merely felt, it had been documented, recorded, written down. And perhaps that was the most terrifying part, because fiction is forgotten, but reality remains in the mind. Cecil was no longer a story to be forgotten. It was a remembered truth. An event everyone knew, but no one fully understood. By the time the name of Hotel Cecil began to be associated not just with isolated incidents but with a specific case, the calendar had entered the modern era. This event seemed to unite all the dark narratives from the hotel's past. It was both documented and filled with unanswered questions. The first striking thing about this case was how ordinary it all seemed at the beginning. A young guest, a short stay, plans to explore the city. Nothing unusual. For someone unaware of Cecil's history, this was just a normal hotel visit. But as the days passed, communication was cut off. At first, this was not taken seriously. People came and went from Cecil. Some left quietly, but this time was different. Days went by. No news. A search began within the hotel. This search process revealed once again why Cecil had earned such a fearsome reputation. Floors were checked, rooms inspected, corridors walked step by step. Yet nothing was found. It was as if the person had melted into the building itself. This continued for days. The details that emerged afterward made the incident not just tragic, but deeply unsettling. Security footage was examined. When released to the public, people watched it over and over. The images were clear but meaningless. Movements occurred, but without explanation. Actions happened, but without reason. These recordings seemed to transfer Cecil's atmosphere directly to the screen. Everyone who watched said the same thing. There was an unseen pressure. The person in the footage was alone, yet did not behave as if alone. It was as if they were fleeing something, but what? No one knew. The developments following the incident permanently sealed Cecil's name. The answers found did not reduce the questions, they multiplied them. Official statements made sense, but the feelings they evoked did not align with logic. This case brought every story from Cecil's past back into discussion. Events from years ago were recounted again. Former employees' accounts. People began connecting the past with the present. And this merging created a chilling picture. It was as if Cecil had appeared in every era, with a different face but the same effect. After this event, Cecil was no longer just a hotel. It had become one of the most talked about dark places of the internet age. Videos were made, long analyses were conducted. Hours of discussion took place, yet no discussion reached a definitive conclusion. Because Cecil did not feed on clarity, it existed in uncertainty. With this chapter, Cecil's story reached its peak. Everyone now knew the building, yet none could claim to fully understand it. And that was the purest form of fear, because a person cannot escape what they do not understand. And Cecil was exactly that. Inescapable, yet inexplicable. The name of Hotel Cecil had now been irreversibly sealed. The events were not forgotten, the stories did not dwindle, and the curiosity never ended. At this point, the hotel had two choices: either continue living with this darkness, or attempt to escape its past. The second path was chosen. Years later, Cecil underwent a quiet transformation. First, small steps were taken. Signs were replaced. Interior spaces were reorganized. Some floors were completely renovated. Wall colors were changed. Lighting was increased, but these changes were mostly superficial. What the building carried could not be erased with paint. Later, a bolder decision was made. Cecil's name would be changed. This decision sent a strong message. The tie with the past would be severed. A new name, A new beginning, at least on paper. The hotel had a past it no longer wished to be associated with, but names can change. Stories do not. After this transformation, some guests arrived knowing the new name, but aware of the old stories. With curiosity, with controlled fear. Some came just to look. Others came to feel the past. Cecil's pull was still there. Guests staying in the renovated rooms reported that everything was brighter, yet the feeling remained unchanged. Cleaner, more modern, but still unsettling. These statements were almost identical to those told in the past. During this period, the hotel staff were under a different kind of pressure. They were no longer dealing only with events. They were dealing with questions. Guess what was this building before? What happened here? Answers were kept brief. Long explanations were still unsettling. No matter how much the building housing Cecil was renovated, it could not erase its past entirely. Be those online articles, documentaries. All of it was still there. A change of name could not reset the memory of the building. In this chapter, Cecil became a question mark. Had it truly changed, or was it only covered over? People were divided. Some believed everything was behind it. Others thought the darkness had simply become Kitter. Perhaps the truth lay somewhere in between. Cecil was no longer what it once was. But the old Cecil had not entirely vanished. Some places exist to keep what they have witnessed within themselves. Walls may change. Names may change, but the feeling remains. And Cecil remained one of the strongest examples of that feeling. With this chapter, the story approached its closing. Yet the darkness of Cecil was not fully gone, because this darkness was far more than a building. It was a reminder of what silence could lead to, and how some places could change a person. Hotel Cecil still stands today, in the middle of the city, inside a building that people pass by every day. To an outsider, it may look ordinary. Its renovated appearance might even go unnoticed. But for those who know, this building was never just a structure. Today, Cecil is known by a different name. It has a different face. Inside, visitors see brighter corridors, more modern details, a cleaner look. But some guests still say the same thing. Words have changed, but the meaning has not. There was an unease inside me. This unease comes from the past. The story of Cecil was not closed. It was merely archived in newspaper clippings, in documentaries, in the dark corners of the internet, in videos watched at night, in stories whispered from mouth to mouth. These stories do not disappear. They change form, because Cecil has become a symbol of loneliness, of being ignored, of the accumulation of silence. What happened there was not only individual tragedy, it was the trace of an era, a city, a system. Perhaps that is why Cecil never fully closed. Because the story was never just about the building. It belonged to people. And as long as people do not change, stories like this do not end. Today, someone standing in front of Cecil can look up and see the windows, without knowing who stayed behind them, who could not sleep at night, who woke up differently in the morning, who would never be the same again. This unknown still lingers. The scariest part of Cecil was never the number of events that occurred. The scariest part was how ordinary they could become. At some point, people got used to it. The news was read. The videos were watched. and life went on. But the building remained, and perhaps the true ending of the story lies here. Cecil did not close. It did not disappear. It merely went into waiting, to be remembered, to be wondered about, to be spoken of again. Some places exist that do not frighten you, but do not let you go. Cecil was such a place. Its story was told, but it was not completed, because some stories are not meant to be heard.